All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us this morning. My name is Kristin Ronai. I'm the Director of Compliance for the OHSAA, and I'm assisted today by my colleague, Mr. Ronald Sayers, who is the Compliance and Eligibility Specialist. We make up the compliance team here, and again, are really happy to speak with you this morning. A couple logistical items before we get started. A reminder that this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted online. Last Monday's meeting is already posted, so if you want to double dip on the meetings, you can review both of them later this week when they're posted. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, or if you'd like further clarification on any items presented, please just type in your question or comment into the sidebar. Mr. Sayers will then pose these questions to me at the appropriate time for further clarification. And lastly, I wanted to let you know that Mr. Sayers and I are always willing to provide additional presentations or answer any one-on-one questions which may arise as a result of this presentation. We're here to serve you with clarity, consistency, and compassion, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us afterwards if needed. So before we get started on the content, we would be remiss if we didn't take every opportunity we had to thank you, the school administrators, and the district and state board members for all the work you have put in over the past year. And I'm sorry to all the Blue Devil fans out there, but as Dean Smith used to have his teams point to the passer when someone assisted a player with a score, this association is pointing at and recognizing each of you today. We could not have conducted our fall or winter tournaments without the efforts of each of you enforcing ever-changing social distancing guidelines, mask mandates, and venue capacities. Let's keep up the great work and be sure that our spring sport athletes get to the tournaments that they have worked so hard for. With respect to this meeting and in accordance with Constitution Article 8.110, today we will be presenting the approved 2021 referendum items for public explanation and discussion. We will also be providing brief updates on some important topics regarding education-based athletics at the end of this presentation. But first today, we're going to focus on the referendum items. As a reminder, making changes to your Constitution and articles and bylaws is outlined in Article 8. These modifications are voted upon in May by the member school principals and become effective by a majority vote. This year, there is one Constitution issue and 8 bylaw proposals, all of which were approved by the Board of Directors. There is also an option to change the rules via a petition route, but no individual carried out that option this particular year. If these items presented are passed, they become effective August 1st unless otherwise specified, and there are 2 this year which, if passed, will become effective May 16th of 2021. As was done last year, voting will be conducted within MyOHSAA via the school principal's account. The link will become active on May 1st, 2021, and the ballot is due by May 15th at 4 o'clock. Please take note that May 15th is a Saturday this year, so I would strongly encourage you principals to do your voting early so you don't forget or run into any problems and be in a position where you cannot contact an OHSAA staff member on a Saturday. Article 8.1.9 does require each school to return a ballot, but there will be an option to abstain from voting on any particular issue if that is so desired. This year, there are no 7th and 8th grade specific issues, so the ballot will only present for high school principals. There will be no obligation for 7th and 8th grade principals to vote this year. Because of the importance of these rule changes, we do encourage you to discuss them with your school boards, administrative teams, and other area schools and such. You can also discuss them at any upcoming league meetings, and as mentioned, feel free to reach out to the compliance staff for any clarification you may need prior to voting. For ease of comprehension, the language included in this presentation represents abridged or condensed formatted referendum items. I would strongly encourage each of you right now to go ahead and pull up the full text of the referendum items by clicking on the link which was sent to you, or you can access them by going to ohsaa.org, clicking on the school resources dropdown, going all the way to the bottom and clicking on referendum voting, and then go to the 2021 referendum voting issue. If you click on the April 9th referendum items, those will bring you to the exact language which you'll be voting upon. So getting into the issues, the first issue for your consideration is an exception to the referendum voting deadline, which came about this year since it is the first year the deadline fell on a weekend after the implementation of online voting. In years past, the deadline has always been May 15th at 4 o'clock, but we never want schools to face problems with technology or not have access to the staff if there are any questions about a certain issue. So the proposal is represented as an exception, and it is to change the deadline to 4 o'clock on the next business day if May 15th falls on a weekend or a holiday. This one's pretty straightforward and comes as a direct result of advancements in technology our office has been able to implement. It should be noted that if it passes, this issue becomes effective May 16th, 2021. So that was the only Constitution issue. The next issue is represented as 1B and would be an editorial change to the bylaw, to the language in Bylaw 224, which is the competitive balanced tiering process for public schools. It's important to note that there is no change in the actual application of this issue. You can see the exact language on the bottom of page 1 on the website if you followed along there, and you will see that there are 2 specific changes. The first is that the word parent is being changed to legal guardian. This is because the executive director's office has been questioned on different interpretations when a student lives within a district with a non-parent who has legal custody. In reviewing past guidance and in discussions with the Competitive Balance Committee, a change from parent to legal guardian more accurately reflects the intention of this tier analysis. The second change cleans up the language for Tier 1 to show that there are 2 distinct ways a student in a multi-high school district can be coded as Tier 1. The first is if they live outside the district but have been continuously enrolled in the district since the start of 7th grade. Or the second way is if they do live in the district but happen to attend a school outside of their assigned attendance zone. The current language as it's written puts an unnecessary review on a student's educational history if they've lived in the district but just within a different attendance zone. Again, this change is simply editorial to show that there are 2 distinct ways a student in a multi-high school district can be coded as Tier 1. Next up is issue 2B, and it is actually a new regulation that would be codified under Bylaw 413 if it ultimately passes. The issue is being proposed because the executive director's office is often questioned on what ineligible students are and are not permitted to do during their period of ineligibility. To specify, this would be applicable for a student who is ineligible due to transfer, grades, and ejection, or any other regulation which requires a period of ineligibility. You can see the new language here at the bottom and see that it provides clear guidance on this topic and would not allow an ineligible student to participate in any interscholastic sports contest, would not allow them to be dressed in full uniform for any such contest, and would not allow them to participate in pregame warm-ups during their period of ineligibility. However, this rule does give discretionary authority to each school to determine if you want to allow an ineligible athlete to continue to practice with the team, travel with the team, sit on the team bench, but just not in full uniform and such. These final items would be completely up to the school administrator. One question that we already have been posed with respect to senior night athletes who are ineligible. We would not consider the senior night presentation before a contest as part of the contest or as part of the official warm-up. So if you wanted to allow an ineligible senior to be fully dressed for this type of senior award presentation before the game, that is fine, but then they would have to remove their uniform for the actual contest should this bylaw ultimately pass. The next issue is 3B, and it is another editorial clarification which was recommended by a member of our appeals panel and approved by our board of directors. In addition, if this is approved, the addition, if approved, would add language to Bylaw 431 Exception 6, which is the rule that allows certain classifications of non-enrolled students to play sports for their residential public school. The exact language can be found online, shaded in gray at the bottom of page 2. But in short, this addition is being recommended to remind administrators that these students participating at a public school in accordance with state law are still subject to all other areas of Bylaw 4, which is the student eligibility bylaw. Specifically, and I've done a few presentations about this so far in our monthly compliance update videos, we are concerned that students who start at their local public school and then who transfer to home education or transfer to an online school are not being correctly identified as transfer students. Even though they may be allowed to continue playing sports at your school in accordance with state law, when they withdrew from your school, they forfeited their opportunity for full eligibility. They changed their enrollment and attendance, which makes them a transfer student who is subject to the transfer consequence unless they can meet an exception to restore full eligibility. Later in this presentation, I'll talk about a common exception that you'll likely be able to use to restore their eligibility, but it will require a decision on the part of the family. But for this issue, 3B, the point is that language is being added to help school administrators recognize different areas of eligibility that non-enrolled students could potentially be impacted by. Next up is issue 4B, which is another sort of editorial change that would clarify the application of the transfer bylaw to reflect two things. The first is that an ineligible transfer student is not allowed to participate in any OHSAA tournament games, but that they are permitted to play for the approved number of regular season games, which is for the first 50% of the maximum allowable regular season contest. That is true even after the tournament has commenced. This issue was brought to our attention with the modification of this past year's football schedule, with some teams only playing 3 or 4 regular season games prior to entering the tournament. I'll direct your attention over here to the chart on this slide. In this case, a transfer student who did not meet an exception was ineligible for their tournament game, but then became eligible again for game number 5 because that was within that first 50%. After game number 5 is completed in football, that is, then they would become ineligible for game number 6 and for the rest of the season. Again, this is just making sure that they can play for the first 50%, but they're always ineligible for the tournament, and this proposed language just cleans that up. The final change in issue 4B, which is represented in this final bullet point, is related to the note which precedes the different exceptions to Bylaw 472. If you have your handbook handy, this note is right underneath the transfer chart and has been rewritten to show that the exceptions are intended to be used for cause and effect situations, like when a family moves and this forces the student to transfer to a new school. The exceptions are not intended to be used as loopholes for students who want to transfer to a new school, so their family decides to move to make sure that full athletic eligibility is restored. This new language, if it's approved, would give the executive director's office some more discretion in trying to stop those who are trying to cheat the system and use these exceptions as loopholes. All right, issue 5B, if you're following along online, has a lot of new language and strikeouts of the old language, but there is not as much change as what you might initially be perceived. As a reminder, Bylaw 472, Exception 9, which is what this addresses, allows a student to transfer to the school located in the district where the student's residential parent or legal custodian has lived for at least 1 year and not lose any athletic eligibility. If this issue passes, the first modification would give the executive director's office some discretion in application instead of making this an exception to which a student is entitled. You would also be adding the phrase transfer of participation opportunity to the first sentence to clarify that non-enrolled students are also permitted to use this exception, but it is still only a one-time use to restore their full athletic eligibility. This is an important point which I briefly talked about earlier to make sure that non-enrolled students are eligible in all respects. So follow along with me here. If a student starts at a public school and transfers to an online community school, for example, they can use Exception 9 to restore their full athletic eligibility at the public school they previously attended, assuming their parents live in the district, of course. But that is the only time that this student can use this Exception 9. If they ever end up physically transferring back to the public school at a later date after already using Exception 9 as a non-enrolled student, then they would have to fulfill the transfer consequence at that time. So those are some decisions that the family will have to make about when they might want to use this Exception 9 if there's a potential for the student to ever come back to the school. Thirdly, in this last bullet point here, the new language to note number 1, if approved, would now allow a multiple high school district superintendent to request the application of Exception 9 at a high school outside the student's assigned attendance zone or at a school not closest to the parent's residence in district that do not have defined attendance zones. But it can only be used if the transfer to the schools can be supported by objective educational criteria. We have received much feedback that students in multi-high school districts were being forced to pick between academics or athletics when transferring back to the district because their preferred education option did not align with the school at which they were permitted to utilize Exception 9. This new language would now allow the district to request this application at a different district school other than what the student would have been assigned. Some examples of this objective educational criteria that we would consider would include maybe skipping over a poor performing school, transferring to a trade-specific school, and that any request would need to be accompanied by the student's transcripts when they submitted the application. The effective date of this amendment, if passed, would be May 16, 2021. Therefore, if a student in a multi-high school district transfers between May 16th and July 31st of this year, then he or she is still permitted to potentially utilize this new language within Note 1 if it passes. So I have 3 more issues here to present to you guys, so hang with me. Next up is issue 6B, and it talks about Bylaw 473, which is the mid-season transfer rule. Again, as a reminder, this rule essentially prevents a student from playing for 2 different schools during the same season. With respect to the proposed modification, the stricken language in the first paragraph removes a reference to the fact that the student is ineligible at the school to which the student transferred. There may have been occasions where a student transfers in the middle of a season, maybe to an online community school, and wants to resume participation back at the school where they are no longer enrolled in accordance with state law. This proposed language cleans up the fact that if a student transfers in the middle of the season, then he or she is ineligible for the rest of the season, regardless of where they desire to continue a participation opportunity. Secondly, the new highlighted language to paragraph 1, again, if you're following along online, talks about the application of the transfer consequence for the next season whenever a mid-season transfer occurs. This type of rule has pretty significant implications that have unfortunately led to some forfeitures in the past when applied incorrectly. So we're going to take the time to explain it here. This concept is currently found within Bylaw 472, but because of its importance, we wanted to move the language also into this current bylaw, Bylaw 473, where it's more applicable. So in layman's terms, an example of what this language means, and for all of you visual learners, you can look at the chart here. If a student transfers during a basketball season in which they have already played in a regular season game at a different school, and if their new school has 3 games left on their regular season schedule, the student is ineligible for those 3 games as well as the tournament, and then next year they would sit out of all the preseason contests and for the first 8 regular season games. 3 last year and 8 the next year would equal 11, which is the transfer consequence in basketball. So this student would become eligible beginning with game number 9 and through the rest of the season and the tournament. The reason this rule is implemented is because we do not want a transfer student to have to miss 2 tournaments, so their consequence is prorated for the first half of the next season. So again, this language is new to this particular bylaw, but the concept is not new in terms of application because it's currently found in Bylaw 472. And finally, this last bullet point here, language was also added to clarify what a sports season is for application of this rule. Previously, the language encompassed a student who transferred at any time within the season, potentially even after their new school was eliminated from the tournament. And as mentioned, the concept behind this proration is to ensure a mid-season transfer student does not have to miss 2 postseason tournaments. Therefore, this bylaw only comes into effect if a student transfers to a school that still has contests, either regular season or postseason, left on their schedule. If a student transfers to a new school after their new team has already concluded its participation in contests, then the student would simply have a normal transfer consequence the following year, unless an exception could be met to restore full athletic eligibility. All right, so if you zoned out with all those transfer example language we've been discussing, it's time to lock back in here into this next topic. Issue 7B is our second to last issue, and it is a rather significant overhaul to some of the language within the recruiting bylaw. In general, these edits are being proposed to provide more clarity within these rules, making them hopefully easier to follow. I'll go through the highlights of some of these changes. So the first, within Bylaw 492, it clarifies that it is permissible for non-public school coaches to have contact with students in grades 7 through 8 if the non-public school is K through 12 and if the 7th and 8th grade building is located in the same building as the high school, and those 7th grade students would be assigned to attend the high school where the coach or the school employee works. There's also a note to Bylaw 492, Exception 2, to clarify that non-public school boundaries used for competitive balance purposes are not the same as those referenced in Bylaw 492. Bylaw 493, number 2, clarifies that schools who utilize mailings or electronic transmission for admission recruiting can't send information to people by name until a student has attended an open house or an information or shadow day as outlined in Bylaw 493, number 3. Prior to attending a shadow day, the use of occupant or residence is permitted, but only by the school and not by a coach for athletic reasons. And lastly, on this side, within Bylaw 494, number 3, it clarifies that a coach can talk with a student during a shadow day in the presence of a school administrator if the conversation centers around program procedures and expectations, but not on the student's expected impact on the program. If the coach also serves as an administrator, meaning if the coach is also an AD, then the school principal should work in facilitating that conversation. Some more edits to this particular bylaw is that language was removed and now allows the executive director's office to approve an off-site open house, even if other campus facilities are available. This gives schools more options when deciding where to conduct such open house, and the option is now presented as an exception. Within Bylaw 493, number 5, it has had language added to clarify that congratulatory billboards and newspaper ads are permitted as long as the marketing is congratulatory in nature and not used to promote a specific athletic program. Specifically, if a school would win a state championship and if they wanted to put up a billboard to congratulate their team, that is permitted. Within Bylaw 493, number 6, it's been modified to clarify that brochures for athletic camps are solely to be used to advertise for a specific non-interscholastic opportunity, meaning a camp or a clinic, and that these brochures are not to be used to promote the school. Likewise, in 494, number 9, it's been added to support the notion to clarify that admissions personnel and administrators are not permitted to be in attendance at these non-interscholastic camps and clinics that occur during the summer to answer questions about school enrollment. The families would need to contact the school if they had questions about that. And the last edits to the recruiting bylaw, issue 7B, is within Bylaw 493, number 3, Bylaw 495, and Bylaw 496. Each of these have been modified to provide further clarification on when a school or coach is permitted to have unobstructed communication with a student who is not presently enrolled in their school. This is intended to prohibit prohibited influence from occurring, before the student has made a final enrollment decision. Specifically, students and coaches are not allowed to contact prospective student athletes about athletics, even if they shadow at a school, until either 1, the student's application fee is submitted to the school for tuition-based schools, or if the school accepts the student's application for enrollment for non-tuition-based schools. All right, I'm guessing there may have been a few questions there potentially, but I am going to go ahead and finish up with this one final issue before fielding any questions about these referendum items. So the last issue we have is issue 8B, which modifies Bylaw 9. This is the bylaw which deals with contests requiring special attention, and the language starts on the middle of page 11 for those of you following online, and you can see that there are 3 basic adjustments. First, it clarifies that member schools are permitted to play non-member or non-interscholastic teams at their own discretion. That was never codified anywhere. We thought that was important to add. The second one, if passed, would require approval from the OHSAA office prior to schools traveling to any non-bordering states or provinces to play, such as for your baseball or softball spring trips or any other trips to non-bordering states. So for any travel to a non-bordering state, you would first need to obtain approval from our office, which is a change from the past. If this issue passes, it becomes effective August 1st of this current school year, so you will need to get approval before proceeding forward with any non-bordering contests which you already have contracted for the 21-22 school year. We don't foresee hardly any denials of these particular requests, but it will allow us to just track and monitor these events, which potentially may need to be sanctioned more closely. And the last proposed modification is found within Bylaw 492 to comply with some recent revisions to the NFHS sanctioning requirements. There are now 4 types of events in which a school would need to secure a sanction through the National Federation of State High School Associations. The first is for any event which includes either an Ohio or an out-of-state school that is, and this is important, that is co-sponsored or titled in the name of an organization outside of the school community. So any of those events need to be sanctioned. The second are any events involving non-bordering states where 5 or more states are involved. The third are events involving non-bordering states if more than 8 schools are involved. And then the last are events involving 2 or more schools that include teams from a foreign country, with the exception of Canada and Mexico. So that completes the public presentation of the 9 approved 2021 referendum items, which will be made available to member school principals to vote upon between May 1st and May 15th. At this time, I would like to field any questions which may have come in regarding these specific topics. Mr. Sayers, any that came in?
So currently we do not have any questions.
Okay. Well, thank you for that information. Sorry, everybody, about my speakers there. So before we conclude, we have a few other brief reminders. The first is that, if we can get there, a reminder that the scholarship bylaw has been waived through the first grading period of the next school year. So again, please ensure that right now your athletes are scheduling at least 5 credits at the high school level or 4 classes at the 7th and 8th grade level. That way they make sure they have enough during the first grading period, because if they don't, then their ineligibility would commence for the second grading period of the 21-22 school year if the students fail to pass the appropriate number of credits or classes during the first grading period. The second one we want to make sure that you are aware of is that we will be repeating divisions from this year for next 21-22 year. Due to a concerned that the data collected in October of 2020 may have been unreliable or skewed, with many students following non-traditional learning models. We did make the recommendation, and it was approved by the board last October, that we will reuse the tournament divisions, and then this coming October 2021, we'll be collecting new EMIS numbers that schools have the opportunity to take a look at. And then once we have those finalized, those will be utilized for the 22-23 and 23-24 school years. And that, in terms of a timeline, you should expect that new divisional alignments for fall and winter will be released next spring, so a year from now, and that spring divisional alignments should be released in August of 2022. A few other final reminders. It does say that the pre-participation physical evaluation is posted online as of last Friday, and I checked, those are up there now. There is also a version in Spanish, so you have those at your disposal for this current school year, or the next school year, I should say. A reminder that there is a change to the General Sport Regulation 751, which allows coaches to have unrestricted contacts with athletes from June 1st to July 31st. That contact used to be limited to 10 days, but this does not include August. So no decision has been made on whether to continue this regulation into the future. But again, just to remind your coaches that this summer they are permitted to have unrestricted contact with their athletes. Keep reviewing those weekly administrator updates for COVID related reminders. Either last week or 2 weeks ago, it removed the venue limitation capacities for outdoor sporting events. So just keep up to date on those. And then the last reminder is that Executive Director Yu does plan to make some sort of recommendation on membership dues and fees this coming Thursday to the Board of Directors. So if you've not already done so, please make sure that you take the time to review some of those presentations, which are posted online, in order to gain clarity on any questions that you might have about that potential process. So that completes this version of the 2021 athletic discussion meeting. Mr. Sayers, were there any other questions that came in?
We did receive one question regarding the sanctioning. So can you go over again what types of contests will require NFHS sanctioning along with approval from our office?
Goodness. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. So if you've not already done so, please make sure you pull up that language online, because I think that will help you. So for any non-bordering state contest, it will need approval from our office. Again, we don't expect too many denials of those, but it's just to allow us to monitor them more closely. So if you already have one scheduled for a non-bordering state for the next school year, we'll go ahead and we'll get those information out to the schools regarding the forms that you can have. So any non-bordering state is approval from our office, and the ones that require sanctioning from the NFHS, there's 4 different events. The first is any event which includes either an Ohio or an out-of-state school that is co-sponsored by or titled in the name of an organization outside of the school community. So let's say Raising Cane's wants to sponsor an event, a big basketball tournament. That event would need to be sanctioned by the NFHS before it can proceed forward. The next type of event is events involving non-bordering states where 5 or more states are involved. So if it's if it's Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, and Pennsylvania and West Virginia, that would not need to be sanctioned because those are all bordering states. It's only if there's non-bordering states where 5 or more are involved. The third one that would need to be sanctioned is events involving non-bordering states if there's more than 8 schools involved. And then the final one is events involving 2 or more schools that includes a team from a foreign country, with the exception of Canada or Mexico. So thanks again for that question. If you do have continued follow-up, feel free to reach out to us. But Mr. Sayers, any others that came in? indicated no. So thank you again so much for all that you are doing to try and facilitate the spring sports right now and all you've done so far this year. We are very grateful for the work that you've put in, and you can trust that we're working just as diligently here in this office to try and assist you through these difficult times, which hopefully will be ending soon. So wishing you all the very successful conclusion to the end of the school year, and have a wonderful day, everybody. Thanks so much.